This has been my second appearance in the Seed Dialogue, which I really enjoy, and I look forward to coming here this year. I gave the talk the first day, one of the workshops, and I attempted in that talk to try to tie a lot of things that are normally not tied together. I certainly wanted spirit in the mix. I wanted the purposefulness and the morality of the universe to be paramount. And yet, on the other hand, I'm a scientist, and my undergraduate work was done in Darwinian evolution, in the history and philosophy of science. And I've always struggled with this idea of purposelessness and lack of direction in the universe, and as it's so much a part of science to think of things happening randomly without any purpose, that I've struggled with this because I also know from my own experiences in ceremony and in dreams and visions that we live in a purposeful moral universe. In fact, we live in a personal universe, not an impersonal one. We live in a universe where the subject and object are not disconnected, where it's possible for them to be one and the same. We live in a universe where in reality space and time are abstractions, but form a unity at some levels of thought, and that spirit is a way to break through chronological time, to telescope time in ceremony, and to then live in a universe, be in a universe that has no boundaries whatsoever. And that universe is a universe of spirits or energies that move matter, that move us, and that movement happens in many different kinds of ways, both spiritually and materially. I wanted to bring together the conventional idea in evolution of slow, gradual, incremental changes in genetic adaptation to an environment that is slowly changing incrementally as well, so that those species, or rather individuals, not species, that are better adapted to a particular niche, ecological niche, then pass on their genes of better adapted genes to the offspring, and those offspring reproduce, gives an advantage to that individual, and then through additional reproduction that individual becomes a species, and we have a species in the physical sense. But we also have behind the physical world, behind the shadow of the real world, as in Plato, a spiritual process and spiritual entities that do not operate in terms of Newtonian time, space, and that they are more akin to what happens in quantum mechanics, as we all know. So it was very important that I try to resolve this difference. And I did this by pointing out that species have been more or less intact as in their essential characteristics, even while the morphology changes over time, and the behavior to some extent changes over time. They serve the same function in the world, ecologically speaking, in the physical world. And that then when species are evolved out of the system, they drop out because they're not well adapted. Sometimes extinctions occur. We've had 5 major extinctions. We're in what some people call the 6th major extinction now because of rapid climate change and industrial pollution and so forth and so on, habitat destruction, etc. Nevertheless, the spirits that represent those species continue through all of that without being lost. And one of my old mentors, Bill Tallbull, who's Northern Cheyenne, and a direct descendant of Dull Knife, who very famously broke out of a compound in Oklahoma and went north to his homelands, leaving the Southern Cheyenne back in Oklahoma. A man that has a great reputation within his own tribe, and was Vine Deloria's prime consultant in Vine's understanding of Plains culture, because Vine didn't speak Lakota. So without the language, sometimes you miss things, as brilliant as Vine Deloria was. And whereas Bill spoke Northern Cheyenne, and he had extensive spiritual experiences, and he taught me that those spirits that are lost temporarily, the species that are lost temporarily rather, go, metaphorically speaking, into spirit lodges, meaning that they're still around, and they're waiting for the time when the environment is such that they can re-engage with the environment and come out. And in Amazonia, the Pachamama holds those spirits in her breast until the time is ready for their release at a time when the environment is better, and so on. So in this universe, nothing is ever really lost because of the spirit world. And under the right circumstances, with the right prayer and the right focus, one can relearn traditional things again. And I've seen that happen with the Tule River people, who brought back 30 songs on Vision Quest after sobering up for 1 year. And in checking with anthropologists, those songs did once exist and had been recorded on wax discs. There's many, many other examples of that having happened. So we need not fear that we've lost everything. We can get it back. And we are, in fact, doing exactly that. A combination of the spiritual approach and salvage ethnography. We're putting all this together. And peoples all over the world are beginning to go back to the future, so to speak, to bring the important aspects of the culture and the language back in very different and changed conditions. And that's adaptation. With environmental change due to global warming, due to climate disruption and climate chaos, which I think is a better term than climate change, which sounds a bit benign and normal, people are very challenged to adapt to climate change. And some of the older traditional ways are no longer working. For example, weather forecasting is no longer working very well, especially in the Arctic and in semi-arid areas like East Africa and Australia. And so people have had to combine modern methods with traditional methods. And a good example is that studies have shown that a combination of traditional weather forecasting, in which there's probably 150 things that people use around this world to forecast the weather, and sometimes there's maybe dozens in one place, depending on individual's own experience. Despite that, if you call the Weather Bureau, meteorology comes into the situation, and you stand a better chance of making better predictions. Science, Western science, is complementary to traditional ecological knowledge, but you can't translate the cosmologies across the board. They're two very different epistemologies. They're standalone ways of knowing. And because they're standalone, we can't integrate them. We can't merge them, but we can build bridges where it's appropriate between those two systems. And that way, I think we can stand a better chance of adapting. We need to partnership with other entities such as municipalities, counties, states, and we need to be at the policy level, at the UN, World Bank, international investment communities. I work in those areas of the indigenous people's climate change assessment, both at the policy level and at the grassroots level. But we all know that real change is prompted not from the top, but from the bottom. Change happens from the grassroots up. And so I've been, my responsibility is on the steering committee of the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Assessment, the IPCCA, to go from the area where I live, the Klamath Mountains in the Karuk tribe, and over to Pyramid Lake, Paiute, and Washoe in the Central Sierras, Northern Sierras, all the way up to Haida Gwaii in the northwest, and over to Haklip and Mount Curry, Shuswap, Okanagan, Warm Springs, and Umatilla and Grand Ronde coming down. So I'm making trips to all these communities to assist them in climate change adaptation. And we have a secretariat in Cusco, Peru, that is like a clearinghouse for all the information that the communities are willing to share about their own experiences. And we're also encouraging them to use their own knowledge and then bringing in Western science as it becomes necessary to round the situation out and proceed forward. So all those things are involved in adaptation. If climate emissions, if CO2 emissions stopped right now today, we'd still have to adapt. And that may be true, as Jim Hansen and NASA pointed out, for hundreds of years to come, not just decades. And so we have to learn to do this now. And we have to bring the experiences of these grassroots people in these communities up to the UN and other higher policy levels so they know what's going on and they can adjust the policies accordingly. We have to get money to do all this. And we've been funded by the Oxfam Novib in Netherlands, and we've been funded by the Christensen Fund based in Palo Alto, California, and to the tune of about $2 million, but that's just to get going. We're in 12 countries, so our big challenge now is to get money for the next phase, which is year 2, and so we've gone to Ford. We got some money from Ford Foundation. We're going to the Christensen Fund again for their November board meeting and so on. But these are the kinds of things I'm involved in. Then this ecosystem-based adaptation, which means that people are then addressing ecological degradation, the resiliency of ecosystems that sustain them, and cultural resistance, because they have to pay attention to those really important cultural species because they're moving north or uphill, and typical communities cannot move out of their area with them. So then you have to start looking at the adapted plants, the adapted animals of an area, especially the plants, to select those individuals or populations or subspecies that are best adapted to harsher conditions, warmer conditions, earlier flowering time, whatever, and propagate them so we can keep them there to slow down the rate of change. Now, in the end, we may have to substitute other cultural resources, but the idea is to slow things down. And that has been done many times in the past. During the plains droughts of the late 18th century, 18th century, during the fur trade, Indians on the plains stopped hunting beaver in order for the beaver ponds to refill with water so they and the bison would have water to drink. In the Ice Age times, the Nuchanuth have stories of when ice had blocked a particular river, when the salmon were coming up to their natal spawning streams, that the people would take salmon spawn in wet moss and transfer it to another watershed, to another creek, so the run would continue. And the last time that happened was in 1911 at Hell's Canyon slide, which was enormous, where the Salish people saved 5 wild stocks of salmon by building a flue around the slide. Or when, at the end of the first thermal following the Ice Age, when things were warmer before they got cooler, which we're at the end of that cooling stage now, that they used fire to protect their white oaks, which are a very important resource, from invasion by conifers in the north tip of Vancouver Island, in the Kwakayutal area. And then gradually, of course, because of cooling, the conifers gained the ascendancy over time, but they were able to slow that process down. Now white oak is found only in the south tip of Vancouver Island, but it's still an important resource there. Up north, they've changed other resources. So the idea is to slow all of this down. And that's called cultural resistance. Just as in ecology, you resist change by not being thrown off your trajectory, but you're able to immediately get back on it. And resilience is the same way. But indigenous people have a very, very long track record, proven track record of adaptation and resilience. We're still here after 500 years, which is pretty damned amazing when you think about it. I think indigenous people have a lot to offer. We're part of the solution. We're not victims. And what we don't want are tears. What we want is partnershiping. And I noticed something that really bothers me in these Sikh dialogues is that often white people feel guilty about their ancestors' role and what's happened to indigenous people. And I think that is so ridiculous. It is simply not necessary. I think that's something they're going to have to work out, because we offer something now, in the here and now, in the present, that is valuable. And that's the ability to know our truth, where we live so well, that when scientists need information, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, about local stuff going on, then they can come and work in partnership on an equal basis with indigenous experts out in the field. And they're doing that in the Arctic, they're doing that in Northern Australia, for example, where scientists and traditional experts are working together in those places in collaborative ways. We need that kind of coming together, because we really are part of the solution. We're not going to be, because think of ourselves as victims, even though we've suffered the most from climate change and bear the least responsibility for it. And at home, in the Klamath Mountains where I live, a very beautiful place in northwestern California, just below Oregon in the Klamath drainage, Trinity watershed, our springs are going dry. And our garden sometimes suffers in end of August, early September, into October sometimes. We have lots of wildfires. And there's many of those kinds of things happening in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. and Southwest Canada. Well, we need to thin the trees, and then we need to bring fire, the right kind of fire, light, frequent, low severity fire, back into the system. And we need to then thin so we can get permanent old growth back in those systems. And then we can get water flowing again, because of so many small trees and brush, through evapotranspiration, all that water is being sucked up into the atmosphere. And we're losing it in the groundwater. The PNW in the U.S. has lost 1/3 of its water over the last half century. Our glaciers have lost about 1/3 of their biomass, of their mass. I could go on and on and on. Our fisheries are in deep trouble. We need to address those, because in the past, people took care of the fisheries. They cleaned the spawning grounds. They felled trees to get backwater eddies, so coho salmon that spent 1 year in the river before going back to the ocean had a place to withstand the big storms that would come at snowmelt time. And on and on and on. I could go on for a long time about that, but you get the picture. Those are the kinds of things in my place that we are doing and that other people are encouraged to do.